Hi everyone, and this is Tracy Berardi here from the Cloud Standards Customer Council. Welcome to another fantastic webinar of ours. We have just published version 3.0 of our guide, Security for Cloud Computing, 10 Steps to Ensure Success. This latest update includes a refresh of relevant security standards, frameworks, and guidelines applicable to secure cloud computing. We've also added new considerations for data privacy, data residency. And so the aim of this guide is to help decision makers evaluate and compare security offerings from different providers in some key areas. So today we'll be walking you through the 10 steps outlined in this paper and highlighting what's new in V3. So again, I'm Tracy. I'll be moderating the presentation today, and at the end of the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A. So feel free to enter your questions in the questions tab here on BrightTalk. Also joined by 3 presenters who contributed to the paper: Claude Boudoir, who's principal consultant and owner of Sebe IT and Knowledge Management. He's also a steering committee member of the CSCC. Mike Edwards, IBM Cloud PaaS evangelist and our resident standards expert. Mike is very active with ISO. And Chris Dotson, senior technical staff member and executive architect, IBM Watson and Cloud Platform. So many CSCC members have contributed to this original paper and its version updates. You'll find the list of the contributors. It's right on page 3 in the white paper. If you'd like to download a copy of the full paper, the attachments tab on BrightTalk, we have a link to the paper. We also have a download of the presentation from today. And I just noticed there was a comment about some echoing, so let me see if I can, hopefully this is better, just adjust it a little bit. So the content today is brought to you by the Cloud Standards Customer Council. So what we do is we work with our large member base and liaison organizations, comprised of several standards development organizations, open source communities, and end user companies to publish vendor-neutral guides on important considerations for cloud computing. So on this slide is the full list of our deliverables from the past 12 months. And we're getting excited here now in 2018 to work on some new topics, as well as more version updates to our series of papers. So each deliverable contains standards, best practices, and customer use cases that we distribute back to the community. Our next webinar after this is coming up on January 24th, where we'll be introducing V2 of interoperability and portability for cloud computing, a guide. It's the last bullet here under 2017. If you're already on our mailing list, you should be receiving an invitation to that webinar very soon. If you're not yet subscribed and you would like to become a member, just visit cloud-council.org on the slide here. It's a free membership, and we'd love to have you. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Mike Edwards to get started. Mike?
Great, thank you, Tracy, and welcome everyone. So it's perhaps not surprising, given the importance of security and privacy considerations generally, and the importance of those considerations for cloud computing, to find out that we've got as far as the 3rd version of our main white paper that deals with security for cloud computing. And unsurprisingly, there's been plenty of action in the cloud computing market, which has caused this update to be necessary. Well, here in this slide, we just go through the high-level view of the things that we've had to do at a high level to update the white paper, and they're listed here. So firstly, there is a whole series of new worldwide privacy regulations that we have to take into account. Those famous letters GDPR will be well known to anyone who has anything to do with Europe, and has to do with the new privacy regulation that's coming in there. But there are also other things we've had to take into account, like new cloud security standards, that have come out since the version 2 release. We've had to look in more detail at data residency considerations, which are also changing in the requirements that various governments and regulators put into place. We've given an extra emphasis to security logging and monitoring. As cloud services have grown and expanded, this has become an area of focus. We've also taken the time to make more prominent the framework for information governance that we talked about, because as people particularly use multiple different cloud services, this becomes an increasingly important factor. We added a section on key management services. Cryptographic keys are very commonly used when dealing with data in cloud services, and key management services for those are becoming very important. We talk also about security for the processes of continuous delivery and deployment. Again, a key element of delivering applications in particular into cloud services. There's also the question of the management of identity and controlling access to cloud services and things within those services. And finally, we have some additional information available on cloud security in other CSCC white papers, and we've added that material. So quite a few changes, but the overall structure that we have for the paper is very generally the same as it was before. We have the same 10-step organization with an appreciation of the overall security landscape, and we discuss the assessment of cloud security. So moving on from that general view, let us look then at the question of cloud security risks, which is where any assessment of security needs to start. And the key to cloud computing is that compared with doing things on premises in your own data center, when you adopt cloud computing, you're effectively giving up control over certain things to the cloud service provider. But you, as the customer of the cloud service, have to take the responsibility for the impact that that has on the security and on the privacy aspects of your business. So you have to take a careful look at the cloud services you're using and how you're using them, and you need to assess the risks for security and privacy that are coming from the use of those services. And we list a whole series of things that you need to think about here. The loss of governance is one thing, where changes to the service can happen outside your control, and you have to be able to deal with that. There's the question of the ambiguity of responsibility between you as the cloud service customer and the cloud service provider. Who is responsible for what aspects of security? It's a key question. There are a series of compliance and legal risks. You, as an organization, will probably have to comply with various laws and regulations in what you do. You need to make sure that when you use a cloud service that you can still meet those compliance and legal requirements. There's the whole question of visibility and the question of audit and how you handle that when dealing with a cloud service provider. You often can't send in your own auditors to examine the cloud service provider's operations, so you have to do things by other means. There's the question of the handling of security incidents when they happen. How is that reported to you, and how does the provider deal with them? The whole question of how authentication and authorization is managed for your users and for your administrators and managers. There's a whole question then in relation to the management of the cloud services, of the vulnerability of the interfaces to the management capabilities that are supplied by the cloud provider to you, and how well are those protected. There's the question of application protection, both applications that you write and deploy into a cloud service, but also applications that are built and deployed by the cloud service provider. and what measures they put in place to protect those applications. The various considerations of protection of data, of where you have personal data, the regulations that apply to those personal data, and how you must handle them. The question of data deletion also hangs around data because of the presence of backup copies, of multiple redundant copies of data, and so on. When you ask for some data to be deleted, how sure are you that data has been deleted and completely deleted? And in a shared environment, that can be a challenge. There's the question of what control there is over any malicious behavior insiders, insiders within your own organization, but also insiders within the cloud service provider's organization. There's the unfortunate question of the potential for business failures of the providers. When you're using multiple providers, that just becomes a bigger issue. And then the question of what happens if there's any unavailability of the service, and the question of lock-in to individual vendors. All these are potential risks you need to go through as part of your planning when dealing with security and privacy issues when you're using cloud services. So all addressed in the paper, just touched on here at a high level. If we move on then from those risks, which are dealt with in the earlier part of the paper, we then move on to what is the core of the white paper, which is the 10 steps you can use to manage cloud security with those previous risks that we talked about in mind. And we found that the 10 steps approach has been quite popular. People like the way of handling things in a stepwise manner, addressing various topics one after the other. So this is the arrangement that we preserved in the current version as it was available in the previous versions of this white paper. So now we'll proceed to look at those steps one by one. Okay, and step one is worrying about governance, risk, and compliance. This is the kind of high-level stuff. If you're going to use some cloud services, then you need to think about how you govern the use of those cloud services and how those cloud services themselves are governed. Who's responsible for what, on whose authorities get things done, and what communication channels exist for things like changes. You are inevitably giving over some control over some aspects of your use of IT to the cloud service provider. And you need to be clearly aware of what you're handing over and how the provider is doing those things. How they inform you of changes, for example, if they update, as a simple example, if they update an operating system level, maybe as a result of a patch for some security issue. How are they doing that, and how are they telling you that they're doing that? So those aspects of governance about up front. You've got to understand your risk tolerance and how any risks are being mitigated in terms of the risks that are most critical or important to your organization. You need to understand the laws or regulations that apply to you and to the services you're using. That may be privacy requirements, it may be data retention laws, whatever. You need to know what those are. You need to understand breach notifications, how that is handled, and you really need to know about breaches in the provider's systems, even if you're not directly impacted. You still need to know that they've occurred. And it's important to know that the primary means that you're going to ensure all of this for the services you use is through the cloud service agreement and the terms that are in there. And these can be backed up by, as is shown on here, the service provider having one of a number of certifications to various standards on their services. So that might be one of the ISO standards like ISO 2718 for privacy or 2717 for security, or it might be something like the SC16 certifications or PCI DSS if you're dealing with credit card data and so on. So having these certifications is one way of you ensuring that you're aware that the provider does the right things. So that was our first step about governance, risk and compliance. Moving on to step 2, we have the question of auditing operational and business processes. Now, normally you would audit your own systems, your own processes, and you need to have the same audits being done against the cloud service providers. These ideally should be done with third-party skilled staff, and the audit should be leveraging some existing well-established standards for security controls. Now, this is normally done not by you directly. You're not going to send the auditors into a cloud service provider. It's normally done by the cloud service provider as part of their certification process, and their proof that it's been done is a certification of one kind or another being attached to their services. So you need to understand what those certifications mean, what it tells you about the environment that the cloud service provider has, that you're getting isolation in multi-tenant environments, you're getting protection of your assets from the staff of the provider, that you have access to appropriate logs and audit trails, and that you're able to self-manage and monitor the usage that your people are making of those hosted services. So that's the second step, audit and operational business process. I'll now hand over to Claude for step 3. Over to you, Claude.
Thank you, Mike. Claude Baudouin here. So now we're getting into step 3, which is the first of several steps that have actually that shift, if you want, from the management and governance aspect to some more technical issues, starting with how to manage people, roles, and identities. And because we're moving into these areas that are a little bit more technical, you're going to start seeing on the right-hand side of the screen some logos of organizations that promulgate standards or provide technology that will help you implement some of the measures contained in the several next steps. We're not going to comment on each of these technologies individually. That's what the full paper and its appendices and references is for. But here's some of the things here on the right-hand side that support this step of managing people, roles, and identities. So what happens with cloud computing is that now you have to manage the fact that users may be users of some of your on-premises services and computers and applications, as well as applications and infrastructure that are managed in one or more clouds. And you don't want to have a separate identity, including username and password, for each of those services for each user. So just the same way single sign-on has been become necessary and widely adopted inside an organization, you want to extend that single space of identities to the cloud services that you use, in particular so that you can provision and deprovision people's rights and privileges in one fell swoop and not risk having a disconnect between those things. So the key principle underlying this, apart from the obvious, which is managing a single identity for each user within an enterprise, is that you want to limit access to exactly what role requires and nothing more. You don't want to have users have access to all sorts of systems that they don't require in their daily job, just to limit the risks of security problems related to mistakes as well as intentional misuse. And in order to enable this, you need to ensure or verify that your cloud service provider or providers are going to support some sort of federated identity management so that you can have single sign-on across all the platforms that these users may access, both on-premises and in the cloud. And the logos at right reference some of the platforms for federated identity management, among which you can choose and find out which ones your cloud providers support, and then get on board with managing identities in a federated way through one of those systems. There is the issue of delegated user administration. So the cloud provider is going to have some role to play in handling identities of people who are accessing the cloud, but you really want to be able to manage that from inside your enterprise and remotely enable users to access the cloud. Therefore, you need to have user administration in the cloud services delegated to to administrators who belong to your enterprise. Strong authentication is probably required. We all know the weakness of systems only based on username, passwords, and people putting post-its on their screens. So anything that uses either smart cards or fingerprints or other biometrics, etc., especially in applications with high security requirements, financial applications, health applications, is advisable. So again, what does the provider support and allow you to use? You want to manage users by role and using policies that define what can be accessed according to a role, as opposed to having to individually authorize every user one by one for a specific of uses. So you want to say, okay, all my accounting, financial, my ERP system in the cloud, for example. And then you need to have auditing and reporting capabilities, which is going to be a constant theme of this presentation, because customers of the cloud need to be assured that the list of people authorized to access applications is what they want. When was that authorization granted? When was it revoked? By whom? Etc. And that's required both for assurance and also to respond to regulators. And in a architecture with microservices, then you actually need to also identify the services so that you can manage access to the service, to those microservices. And again, the paper will describe to you a little bit more in detail what we mean here. And who accesses the management platform is important in case there is an incident where someone was authorized who wasn't supposed to be authorized, or vice versa. So the monitoring and logging of the actions taken by people who access the management platform are important. So when your own administrators connect to the cloud administration platform, you want that to be logged and retained, again, for auditing and for investigation purposes. So these are some of the things you need to be concerned with in terms of identity management. You need to verify that the cloud platform provides these capabilities. So with that, we go to step 4. Now we're at the core of data protection, where obviously things have been moving quite rapidly in the last 3 years since we published version 2 of this guide. Data protection needs to be seen as an exercise in risk management, with everything that risk management implies, which, this is a very solid, very robust discipline, but which we now need to apply to the domain of data. Risk management means you need to identify the risks, you need to assess their impact, their probability, you need to look at what are the mitigation measures that you need to put in place, and then what is the residual risk after those mitigations are put in place. Are those residual risks acceptable or not? And if not, keep going around the loop until they are. So we're going to talk later on about privacy. So even though data protection and privacy obviously have a strong connection, here I'm more focused on the security aspect, which has three facets. Confidentiality of information, so the information is not being provided to people who shouldn't see it. Integrity, which means the information cannot be modified in a way that's not justified. And availability, which is obviously the fact that the systems are usable 24/7 if need be. And here it means defense against attacks such as distributed denial of service. This applies to data in storage, but it also applies to data in motion. So if data is transmitted in particular between your users on premises and a remote cloud platform, you need to worry about whether these three aspects of confidentiality, integrity, and availability are also ensured during the transfer of the data. It's not just that the data shouldn't be stolen or accessed or deleted from the cloud storage. They also don't need to be seen or trapped or modified while moving from one location to the other. But this being said, the considerations are going to be slightly different for IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. And the reason is because the allocation of responsibility between the customer of the cloud and the provider of the cloud are going to be slightly different between those three models. And the paper goes into more detail. It's obvious, for instance, that if what you use is an infrastructure as a service, then the provider has very limited responsibility because everything that is installed on that platform, whether it is application or data, is the responsibility of the customer. On the other hand, for software as a service, something like Salesforce or Google Docs, the provider controls much more of the stack and therefore has more responsibility to ensure security, although the customer should never totally abdicate the monitoring and doing what they need to do on their own end to ensure security. So it is important to put in place a certain number of key controls for securing data. You need to have a complete catalog of your data assets, considering all forms of data, including metadata, and including structured and unstructured data, including monitoring data, etc. You need to consider the privacy requirements in tandem with the security requirements, and that's what we're going to see in the next step. And you need to require from the cloud providers that they log and monitor anything related to security, including any privileged access. We already saw in the previous step the requirement to log and monitor administrative actions, and all data activity needs to be monitored so that it is available for inspection, or so that agents can be running on that data continuously in order to raise alerts in case there is an unusual pattern of activity related to accessing or modifying some data. The last point is actually a point that is critical and that is often a source of frustration by some cloud customers, which is that you don't want to wake up in the morning and discover that there was a data breach that could potentially affect your data in the cloud that is being reported on CNN instead of you having received a notification from the cloud provider that there was an incident. So the issue of proactive notification by the cloud provider to their customers that there was an issue, we understand that this is something that the cloud providers are not quite keen to do, but it is much better if you learn of an incident from them, as well as being offered a means to connect and plan together the recovery from the incident, as opposed to seeing splashed over the headlines in the morning as yet another data breach incident, and having to come from behind and react without having been contacted first by the cloud provider. And this is something that we'll talk in step 6 about what you should put in the cloud service agreement, or ensure that the cloud provider offers in the cloud service agreement, and there will be a location to put that. So we move on to step 5, which is privacy policies. And here again, on the right-hand side now, we have certain standards, regulations, directives, etc., pronounced by various organizations. So there's a plethora of regulations about privacy and data protection, some of which are from national organizations, others are from multinational organizations. The GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, is the European Union overall data protection rule, and it is coming in full force on May 25th of this year, 2018. And after that, breaches to the GDPR's constraints can be punished by extremely severe fines per incident. And this is really punitive, and there's a scramble happening now about people wondering and then having to rush to implement controls in order to make sure that they cannot be found at fault for any breach that could happen after May 25. So privacy is distinct from security, because now we're really talking about the handling of personally identifiable information, or PII. And in the handling of PII, it is not just protecting it from access by people who should not have access to it. It's also that certain regulations provide people the right to inspect what data you have about them, correct or get you to correct data that would be false, and also in some countries, under some laws, there's a right to be forgotten, which means that if you hold the data of your customers, your patients, your account holders, etc., they may require to be completely erased from your systems, which is a difficult requirement, but one that you must be ready to meet. And of course, the fact that now that data may be in the cloud, and therefore you need the collaboration of the cloud provider in order to execute these inspections, corrections, and erasures of data, makes it a little bit more complicated. Again, we've had certain privacy laws in place for a while. HIPAA in the United States governs what you can do with patient data in the healthcare system, but the EU GDPR is going to have a major impact for anyone who holds data related to any European Union citizen, and that's 28 countries now, 27 after Britain leaves. So this has a major impact. This implies that all your PII must be tagged correctly, must be identified as being PII, whether, again, it's patient accounts, bank account holders, your own employees, and therein lies a problem for a multinational company. You may want to have a single HR system, for instance, but some of your employees may be in Europe, so they're protected by GDPR. Others are in other countries with their own laws. All that information must be stored securely, which may mean that it is encrypted. It may also be anonymized, but you have to be careful that the anonymization process is strong enough to resist what's called re-identification, the possibility that someone could be stealing your data would be able to guess whose record a particular record is, or obfuscating the data, which means, masking it in some way so that only you can know which record pertains to whom. And again, someone who stumbles over the data or steals it cannot do that. So that the clean data containing the identification of the users is only made available to authorized users, doctors, account managers, etc., etc. Now, you may think if I go into the cloud provider assumes the responsibility for that, and by signing a contract with the cloud provider, I've now absolved myself of those regulations, and the cloud provider has become responsible. You would largely be wrong if you thought that. The primary responsibility for securing the data remains with the data owner, and that is the cloud customer in most cases. This being said, there are certain roles and responsibilities that should be defined in the cloud services agreement, and so that will be an extra reason to scrutinize and manage the process of doing this agreement. And you should monitor the compliance with to that as you use the service. So that, oops, wrong key. So I stepped too quickly. And my bad. Step 6, assess the security provision for cloud. Was I on step 5? I'm sorry, people. Yes, I was on step 5.
Yeah, you were.
Yeah. And so now we go to step 6, and I need to go a little bit faster. I keep pressing the wrong key. Assess the security provisions for cloud applications. So now we're talking about code vulnerability and other security provisions at the application level. And there's a couple of ISO standards. There's a technical report from the ISO 24772, which deals with that. And then there's the whole world of inventories of application vulnerabilities, such as those of OWASP. The split of responsibilities about who is in charge of application security, of course, is going to depend, again, on the model between IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. There will be different roles and responsibilities for ensuring that the applications are secure. In the adoption of DevOps, the continuous delivery and deployment approach to systems means that security actually needs to be really integrated into the cycle from the beginning. So people speak about DevSecOps, but sometimes it's really SecDevOps. That is, you need to look at what are going to be your security considerations up front and integrate that into the entire cycle. And DevOps is newer than some of the other approaches. So this is a significant addition to version 3 of the paper compared to version 2, is the consideration of the impact of security on DevOps, or vice versa. So now we go to step 7, and I think with this step, I am going to pass the baton to Chris.
Thank you, Claude. Although you showed them the slide a little early, what if I was still editing that? But step 7 is about networking. So in the paper, we use the analogy of a hotel. You don't expect a hotel to block every single threat from coming in, but there should be a certain amount of protection around the perimeter, like key card access for the external doors, and they should have sturdy walls between the rooms, for example. Shared cloud environments are similar to that, in that the cloud providers might offer varying amounts of external network protections. For example, the most obvious is the ability to screen certain types of traffic, most often either by using a firewall appliance or network access control lists. And another example is whether the provider offers any way to protect you from denial of service attacks from outside the cloud provider network, or varying levels of intrusion detection and prevention services, although these can be provided as a service separately from the separately from the infrastructure. Also, the logging of your inbound traffic, or the ability to block traffic from certain areas of the world, are important things. So there are a lot of technologies and services that your provider may have for controlling what comes into the internet, from the internet to your cloud instances. And it's, you need to evaluate what the providers have, both your infrastructure as a service provider plus, potentially any other providers. Providers might also give you different options for internal separation within your area of the cloud, both to protect clients from possible attack by other clients, and also as well as allowing clients to enforce separation between different parts of their cloud network. Some examples are like the use of multiple VLANs or a virtual private cloud type of setup. So this can let you do things fairly easily, like create a multi-tier environment with a web server and a DMZ and a back-end servers on separate networks. For both internal and external network controls, you've got to figure out what the provider's capabilities are and weigh those against the needs for your workload and your applications. Excuse me. And then for step 8, physical infrastructure controls they may not be the most exciting aspect of information security, but they are very, very important. Most other IT controls can be overridden if an attacker gets physical access to the systems by things like plugging in malicious USB keys or cold boot attacks or things of that nature. So for that reason, you do need to ensure that your provider has secured the area. Things like anti-tailgating measures, side-to-side barriers to keep somebody from just crawling under the floor, and ensure that only authorized personnel can access the facilities and minimizes the access to those facilities. There might be other controls like encryption that protect your data. You should also ensure that there are secure disposal procedures in case one of your other controls fails for some reason. So, hard drives that are taken out should be destroyed, things like that. Also, from an availability standpoint, you should ensure that the facilities are protected from fire and floods and bad things like that, and that the utilities coming into the building are protected. And then proper disaster recovery and business continuity plans have to be in place. Those generally will protect you from some types of localized disasters, but a regional type disaster, you may be on your own to have something in a different region. And then for step 9, cloud services are based on a shared responsibility model. So the customer is responsible for some things and the provider is responsible for some things. The cloud service agreement that you have with your provider should lay out exactly where those responsibilities lie. And that's going to be different depending on whether you're purchasing an infrastructure as a service or a platform as a service or a software as a service. And even within those areas may be different. So in addition to that, a lot of cloud providers use partners or peers to provide some of the service. So you should make sure that the cloud service agreement covers those partners or peers also, in addition to the main provider you're dealing with. We did talk about this a little bit already in step 4, but cloud service agreements should have provisions to notify you if there's a breach, and some specific timeframes on how long they have to notify you. Obviously, they don't want to tell you something before they have, they know what's going on, but you also don't want them waiting for days or months or things like that. As Claude said, you don't want to see it on television first. And as we discussed in step 5, the cloud service agreement may need to address some privacy provisions, even though that doesn't totally absolve you of responsibility as the customer. Providers should also have some way for you to measure how effective the security controls and the security management is. We do call out other standards. You see some of them on the right, but also ISO 27004, ISO 19086, NIST 855, CIS consensus security metrics for specifically security metrics. And a compliance report like an ISO 27018 or something along those lines can help you understand how well the controls are applied. And finally, for step 10, you do need to understand the security requirements when you decide to terminate your relationship with the provider. It's in some ways a reverse of the boarding process, but the cloud provider should be able to securely delete all of your data within certain timeframes after the exit process completes, either by overriding it or by a mechanism like cryptographic erase, where the encryption keys are wiped so that it can't be read. The provider may have some legal requirements for records retention, but they shouldn't keep your data lying around for a long time, because that raises the risk that it may be inadvertently or maliciously disclosed. So,
thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think back to Mike for a quick summary, and again, to remind the audience, we have some time for Q&A here. If you'd like to submit your questions, just pop them in here through the questions tab, and we will answer them. Mike, over to you.
Yeah, just a brief summary then to complete our overview of the new paper. So we all know that cloud computing was a great positive, in fact, for security and privacy for customer organizations, as long as you approach it in the right kind of way. You need to address the security and privacy challenges that cloud services will give you, and it's important to understand that cloud security and privacy is a joint responsibility in most cases between cloud service customers and the providers, but it's important for you as a customer to realize that you're not giving away your responsibilities when you use cloud services. Yes, the providers may do certain things for you, but ultimately the responsibility for the whole situation rests on you. And the split, the division of responsibilities between you and the cloud provider needs to be clearly formalized in your cloud services agreement. So all those items are factors for consideration. But there is the third version of the security white paper available now, brought up to date with all the latest trends in the cloud market, and I'd encourage you to read it and get the most out of it you can. So I'll hand back to you, Tracy, to finish off the final few slides.
Thank you, Mike, and Chris, and Claude. Yes, so as I mentioned earlier, you're welcome to join the CSCC. It's a free membership, and we'll alert you as new papers and version updates are published. There's a direct link here. If you're interested in getting more involved by contributing to a paper, whether in a writing, reviewing capacity, you have some subject matter expertise, we have various working groups that you can join. And also on this working groups page, we've posted our tentative content calendar for 2018. And all of our existing content, it's posted publicly here on our resource hub on the website. In this final slide that I'll advance to, we've pulled out some of those papers that might be of interest to you now, and are highlighted in the security guide. You'll notice that the CSCC papers reference other documents that we've published. So now I think we can open up to Q&A. We have a few questions that came in. Start with the first one. A general question that came in very early on. Any thoughts on software assurance?
Good. I'll jump in quickly and let others give an opinion as well. So I think we need to distinguish. We do talk about software assurance and secure engineering in, I think it's step 5 or 6 for application security for the stuff that you're putting on the cloud. In terms of software assurance for the code that the provider or providers have written, those would be typically, I mean, you can't directly audit that type of thing very easily, but typically that will be addressed as part of one of the certifications or attestations that the provider has. Some of those do have sections for secure engineering or ensuring code quality. Mike, Claude, I don't know if you've got anything to add there, but.
Well, I think there's two things you can look at that are important there is the work of the System Assurance Task Force of the Object Management Group, and some of their work on assurance case meta models, SACM, Structured Assurance Case Meta Model. And the other is the work of the Consortium for IT Software Quality, CISQ, which is a sort of sister program of the CSCC under the umbrella of the Object Management Group, which has taken and standardized the common vulnerability assessment or common weakness enumeration for software, and asking the cloud provider or asking yourself for your own applications that you put in the cloud, whether you've used those lists of vulnerabilities to audit your code is certainly a first good set of practices.
Thank you, Chris, Claude. Next question is about online certifications. And what certifications may exist online pertaining to cloud or DevOps security?
If I can deal with that, Mike Edwards. I think we've been talking as we've gone along about various standards and certifications that do apply to cloud services, and they are discussed in more detail in the paper. Some of the high-level ones, which you will find on various cloud services, are, for example, the ISO 27017 Cloud Service Security Certification. There are numbers of cloud services that are certified against that. And then, in parallel, you will find the ISO 27018 standard being used for certifications in relation to privacy. So there are examples of certifications that you might expect to find on specific types of cloud services. And if you have a concern about security or privacy for the services that you're going to use, then you should be asking your cloud service provider whether they have certifications for those standards.
This is Claude here. I would add two resources that you need to look at. One is the SANS Institute, which has DevOps security courses online. I do not think that they give you a certificate at the end, but there's certainly one of the key resources in that area. And then the DevOps Institute provides training and certification on the DevOps. And their DevOps course list contains certain aspects related to test engineering and to security. So they're developing, actually, they haven't rolled it out yet, but a DevSecOps engineering training. So that's the DevOps Institute, which, and I'm not, I don't have shares in them. I'm not promoting them for any gain, but I just know that they are a resource.
Okay. Two more questions in our queue, and I think we're looking good on time. The next one, just asking for a quick recap one more time, if possible, the things that the provider should address during the exit process. Steps to ensure a clean exit from the provider. Thanks.
Sure. I mean, essentially it comes down largely, I think, to residual data management. You don't want your data left lying around. You want something, some technical controls that help get rid of your data when you're done using that provider. The longer it lies around, the more chances is that it's, a malicious insider or an external attacker or somebody could make use of, could get unauthorized access to that data. There are other concerns, in the agreements, you need to make sure that they are required to delete your data within a certain amount of time, accepting what's required by law. But it really mainly, in my mind, comes down to residual data. I don't know if Mike or Claude, do you want to add anything to that?
I'd add one more thing, and that is basically the last bullet on the slide that dealt with step 10 is you need to have an assurance, really, before you start using a cloud service, that there will be an orderly, smooth process during exit when you decide to stop using the service. Because obviously you don't want to face a cliff edge where something that you need disappears as soon as you even hint that you're going to stop using that service. So there needs to be a proper process where you're able to take data out of the service and get up an alternative for that service, either in-house or with another provider, and get it up and running before you finally terminate the use of the cloud service. So I think that's the other thing, as well as very much the residual data stuff that Chris talked about. The process being smooth is important.
Yeah, that's a great point. You don't want the provider to sort of hold your data ransom or lock you in by the fact that you can't get it back out, and that is something you have to think about. When you go in, is can I get my data back out later in an orderly fashion when I need it?
And do you see, this is a bit of a longer question, I'll just, one moment, and if you have access to, if you want to read it as well. Do you see cloud services as largely being limited to serving as a document/information repository, or are there opportunities out there for using a cloud service for providing customers and stakeholders access to data that is more real-time or near real-time in nature? An example would be providing external organizations or teams with access to status or telemetry type of data on an on-orbit asset being monitored, such as a satellite.
I don't think go ahead. I don't think any of the cloud services is being limited like that. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll take a shot at it. I mean, clearly it is the proposal of certain vendors to have IoT platforms, Internet of Things platforms that are in the cloud, contain some real-time or near real-time features, and contain a whole catalog of analytics applications that make it advantageous for the customer to use their platforms because of the richness of the analytical environment and potentially the machine learning environment they provide on there. So again, I'm not trying to play favorites here, but Microsoft Azure IoT and IBM Watson IoT would be the two flagship examples of that. So we're not just talking about traditional enterprise data anymore. With the emergence of the industrial internet in particular, we are absolutely talking now, at least on certain IoT-oriented platforms, about clouds for real-time data. The kind of stuff that used to be in silos of SCADA data, supervisory control and data automation, is now, at least in some cases, moving to the cloud to provide better analysis environments.
I think that was pretty comprehensive, Claude.
Yeah, nicely put.
Excellent. Thank you, Claude, Mike, Chris, and for everyone that joined us today. We hope to see you on our next webinar coming up January 24th. We'll be talking about cloud interoperability and portability. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everyone.